I am a researcher on what we would call conflict discourse, which is how do we discuss or report on or talk about conflict. I am a language analyst. I look at how we write about conflict in the news, in academia, but also how political discourse shapes realities on the ground. So if you like, I'm interested in how narratives are built around conflicts, and if those narratives impact in any way, exacerbate or de-escalate conflict. I'm also interested in manipulation of that same discourse, so how we can politically manipulate discourse in order to achieve a certain outcome. So I do this research. I have been particularly interested in this research since maybe 2021, 2022, when I started observing an increase in hate speech in the region. So just to go back a little bit about how I got here. So I was born in Bosnia, Herzegovina, which used to be part of Yugoslavia. We were a federation since World War II until 1992, when a war started. So I was living in a really conflict center, I would say, of Bosnia, and I was a teenager at the time, and I fled with my family, going through refugee camps in former Yugoslavia, and then going through Austria, Italy, and ending in France, where I had some family members. So with my family, we were political refugees in France in '92, and this is also where I lived for the next 10 to 15 years, finishing my secondary education, and then going for a PhD, which I finished with the University of Orléans-Tours. It was a co-direction between the two universities. So my PhD is in African studies, interdisciplinary African studies, but one aspect of my research or my degree is stylistic analysis, which is really analyzing literature, broadly speaking, in different formats. And so I focused originally on Anglophone Africa, but due to the fact that I also speak French and I had to write my dissertation in French, I was able to kind of have a broad understanding of the entire continent. And I was principally interested in how societies during post-colonial times in Africa were building nations following independence. So focusing on decolonization, particularly how African societies decolonize. And of course, that comes with the notion of self-realization, self-determination. So how do African societies get to discuss their own histories? So I was interested in a little bit in this notion of decolonizing epistemology, since Africa was defined through the colonial lens originally and then through a Eurocentric perspective. So I wanted to look at how African societies adopt their own, what we call endogenous, so as opposed to exogenous definition of themselves. And so this is where I have always been interested in, I would say, what happened in Rwanda in 1994 and what culminated to 1994, because I consider that this is kind of like a climax of the contact between colonial Europe and Africa, and the consequences of the colonial presence on the continent. What we found in 1994 is exactly the type of dichotomic or divisionist narrative that was promoted by colonial administrators, explorers, since when they came to Africa to explore and so to speak, discover Africa, they defined or they theorized and categorized people living on the continent in order to divide and rule, but also to administer the colonial power. The type of violence that we found in Congo Belge, in the Belgium Congo, against the indigenous people in Africa is really kind of going to be extended and lead to 1994. Of course, starting in the late 1950s, when exactly the Rwandan people are asking for independence, particularly promoted by the Tutsi minority. Belgium is going to be perceiving that as a threat, and therefore is going to manipulate ethnicities at this point in time, although it has started before. So just to summarize, I'm very much interested in this notion of narrative and maybe how we build from sometimes fake news or conspiracy theories, such as the Hamitic myth, and for the purpose of domination, for the purpose of exploitation of a group of people, we end up using those narratives to convince the world that what we're doing is a valid project. The extreme violence that this led to is something, of course, that in many ways connects to also my country. We also went through an episode of divisionism, which didn't exist before. I can't blame colonization on it. There were several factors, but the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall did impact that region, and therefore it led to divisionism, hate speech, and hate crimes, and hate ideology, and ultimately to genocide as well in Bosnia in 1995, what we call the genocide of Srebrenica. So I think there was this personal connection with Rwanda. It has become my own personal journey to, as a scholar, as a researcher, to in a way use my knowledge and my experience and my research journey to fight against genocide ideology. And so just to maybe finish on that, to go back to 2021, I started being really alarmed by what was happening in Eastern DRC, particularly because I was also very much interested in the UN resolutions at the time and the type of discourse that was reflected in the UN resolutions versus on the ground. So seeing on social media, but also being in contact with lawyers and other human rights activists, researchers who were sharing information about extreme hate speech, or what we can call dangerous speech. In 2021, 2022, I was receiving messages of hate speech, extreme hate speech, talking about the Congolese Tutsi, saying that they're Rwandans, that they come from outside, they're the enemy, they're traitors. So this was promoted by by civil society movements such as Lucha. For example, in July 2022, they were singing this song saying, Rwandans must go home, or Tutsi must go home. So there was this type of manipulation of considering the Congolese Tutsi as not being from there. So this is going back to the discourse that we find in the Hamitic myth, which says that the Tutsi are outsiders, colonizers, which somewhat led to the hate speech that led to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. So it's what we call the Hamitic ideology. So that I could observe elements of that same ideology taking place in Eastern DRC, so particularly on social media. So we would receive daily evidence, video footage of people getting lynched, burned alive, even cannibalized. And it was becoming extremely recurrent, but nothing was reported on it. So the UN was not reporting on it. civil society movements were not reporting on it. Human Rights Watch or human rights organizations were not reporting. The only person that was aware and that then took some form of action was the former Undersecretary General for Genocide Prevention, Alice Nderitu. So she did in 2022 go to Kinshasa to observe any presence of that type of hate speech and hate ideology and hate crimes. And she did issue a statement on November 30th, 2022, where she does talk about risk of genocide, given that we are in this region. So that's, I think, for me, seeing that this is happening and the way that it's being banalized, the way that it's being minimized or not reported on, while at the same time we are almost considering Rwanda, or in this case M23, to be the root cause of the conflict. There was a whole distortion of narrative that required to really be delved into. And just I will finish on this. I think what I was shocked about is specifically the UN Group of Experts reports that would always assess violence to be coming from one side, but then the conclusion would not match what the problem was being identified as. So I saw a complete distortion of discourse, and I was struck by that when I was reading articles by academics and so on. So it was just to explain how I got to be interested in what is happening in the region, but I will develop a little more after.